In the summer of 1942, the German army swept across the southern Soviet Union, crossing vast fields of wheat and dust as if nothing could slow them. After a year of brutal victories, Hitler believed he understood the Red Army completely. He saw them as broken, retreating, incapable of standing against the Wehrmacht's firepower, discipline, and speed. But as his armies reached a city on the Volga River, one bearing Stalin's name, he made a decision that would consume entire armies and reshape the war forever. Stalingrad was not the richest city in the Soviet Union. It wasn't the most strategic. But it was symbolic. And Hitler believed symbols mattered. He became obsessed with erasing Stalin's name from the map. The city would be taken, not as a military necessity, but as a personal victory. That obsession would soon lead the German army into a trap of their own making. When the Germans approached Stalingrad, their tactics reflected everything that had made them successful until that point. They relied on speed, rapid mechanized thrust supported by tanks and mobile artillery. Their doctrine, known as Auftragstaktik, emphasized initiative. Commanders were encouraged to make fast decisions based on the situation around them. Once the objective was clear, subunits acted with aggressive independence. This allowed the Germans to overwhelm slower, less coordinated enemies. But Stalingrad was not an open battlefield. It was a fortress of concrete, brick, and steel, where speed meant little and every meter had to be fought over. The battle began with a massive Luftwaffe bombardment. Thousands of bombs fell on the city, flattening homes, factories, rail stations, and entire districts. The goal was to terrorize defenders and make the city easier to capture. Instead, the destruction only transformed Stalingrad into the worst environment possible for German tactics. Rubble created choke points where tanks could not maneuver. Collapsed buildings formed natural fortresses. Every pile of bricks became a sniper's nest. The Luftwaffe had unintentionally built the perfect Soviet stronghold. As German infantry advanced into the ruins, they expected a shattered Soviet force. But Stalin had already issued Order No. 227, not one step back. Any retreat without direct orders was punishable by death. Blocking detachments stood behind frontline troops, ready to shoot deserters. The Soviets were told to hold the city or die in it. And many chose the former. Soviet tactics inside Stalingrad were brutally simple but devastatingly effective. Instead of defending open lines, Soviet platoons broke into small units that hid inside the ruins. Snipers positioned themselves in collapsed factories, apartments, grain elevators, and even saw systems. Machine gunners dug firing holes in rubble so small they couldn't be seen until they opened fire. Many Soviet defenders fought in groups of 5 to 10 men, appearing and disappearing before the Germans could react. They turned Stalingrad into a labyrinth of traps. One of the most famous defenders was Vasily Zaitsev, a Soviet sniper whose marksmanship spread fear throughout the German ranks. But he wasn't alone. Stalin brought in entire sniper schools, who used camouflage, patience, and intimate knowledge of the ruins to pick off German officers, radio men, and machine gun crews. The Soviets understood that the German army depended on mid-level leaders to maintain tempo. Killing these leaders slowed every German advance. German tactics in the city soon shifted from fast assaults to slow, grinding attrition. They divided Stalingrad into sectors and attempted to capture each block with coordinated infantry and engineer teams. Flamethrowers cleared basements. Grenades cleared rooms. Artillery flattened buildings one after another. But every time the Germans captured a structure, the Soviets launched immediate counterattacks at night. The Germans called them ghost attacks. The Soviets often lost more men than the Germans, but the constant pressure prevented the Sixth Army from ever consolidating a complete victory. The fiercest fighting took place at the tractor factory, the grain elevator, and Pavlov's house. Pavlov's house, defended by a small group of Soviet soldiers, turned into a legend. The building stood in an open square, giving the Soviets a perfect field of fire. The Germans assaulted it repeatedly, using tanks, artillery, and infantry. But the Soviets had fortified the interior with walls of sandbags and furniture. Every room was turned into a defensive position. German soldiers joked that they lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than they had in some entire towns. By October, the Germans controlled most of Stalingrad, but the cost had been enormous. Their supply lines were overstretched. Ammunition was low. Winter was approaching. And the Soviets were far from finished. While the Germans focused on the city, the Soviets were preparing a massive counterattack. Unlike the Germans, who underestimated their enemy's ability to maneuver, the Soviets used deception brilliantly. They built fake bridges upstream to mislead German reconnaissance. They camouflaged entire tank divisions in the steppe. And most importantly, they allowed the Germans to push deep into Stalingrad while weakening the Romanian and Hungarian armies holding the flanks. These forces had fewer tanks, older equipment, and weaker morale. The Soviets saw them as the perfect place to break the enemy's line. On November 19, 1942, they launched Operation Uranus. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, stormed through the frozen steppe. The Romanian lines collapsed almost immediately. Within 4 days, the Soviets had encircled the German Sixth Army inside Stalingrad. What had started as a German siege had become a German prison. Inside the pocket, the Sixth Army still had over 250,000 men. Many believed they could break out before the trap closed completely. Generals begged Hitler for permission to retreat. But Hitler refused. He ordered them to stand and fight, promising that the Luftwaffe would resupply them by air. But reality was very different. The airfields were too far. The weather was too harsh. Soviet fighters dominated the skies. Of the 600 tons of supplies the Germans needed each day, they received as little as 50. Starvation set in. Horses were eaten. Dogs disappeared. Bread rations were mixed with sawdust. Frostbite turned fingers black. German soldiers huddled in cellars, wrapping themselves in curtains and blankets stripped from abandoned buildings. Ammunition was rationed to a handful of bullets per day. Meanwhile, Soviet tactics shifted again. They no longer needed snipers or ambushes. Now they used relentless artillery bombardments, crushing German positions day and night. Street by street, building by building, the Soviets tightened the noose. They bombarded German headquarters, hospitals, and supply dumps. Winter made everything worse: snowstorms, frozen bodies, and trenches turned to ice. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was disintegrating. Entire divisions existed only on paper. Soldiers wandered aimlessly, too starved to fight. Disease spread through the ruins. Soviet loudspeakers broadcast surrender offers. German officers destroyed their maps and burned documents, knowing the end was near. On February 2, the last German pocket surrendered. The once invincible Sixth Army ceased to exist. Of the more than 250,000 men who had entered Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. Stalingrad was not just a defeat, it was the moment the war shifted permanently. German morale shattered. The myth of German invincibility died in the snow. And the Soviet Union, now confident, began pushing west, city by city, village by village, until they reached Berlin. The battle revealed the limits of German blitzkrieg, the power of Soviet resilience, and the brutal transformation of war itself, from fast, sweeping maneuvers to grinding, desperate urban combat. It showed how leadership, doctrine, weather, and human endurance could decide the fate of nations. And it remains, even today, a symbol of unimaginable suffering and unbreakable will.